Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another AIOH webinar. Let me introduce myself. I'm Sharon Johnson, and I'm the Business Manager for the AIOH. So our speaker today is Dr. Sam Hamilton. He's Director of the Occupational Diseases and Hygiene Policy at Safe Work Australia. And before we officially start, I would like to make an acknowledgement to country. So in the spirit of recognition, the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and the community. We pay our respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Now, speaker today is Dr. Sam Hamilton. He's going to give his own introduction, but I'm going to give you a brief introduction that he's an epidemiologist and a public administrator. Has a strong background in public policy focusing on infectious disease management. He's the Director of the Occupational Diseases and Hygiene Policy Unit at Safe Work Australia, and the focus of his team is working on developing national policy and guidance on occupational respiratory diseases such as COVID-19 and silicosis. So today's webinar is timely. As you may have seen, that Safe Work Australia has just launched their request for public submissions on the Consultation Regulation Impact Statement on managing the risks of respirable crystalline silica at work. So Sam's presentation will discuss Safe Work Australia's Occupational Lung Diseases Work Plan for 2022. And just before I pass you over to Sam, may I request that you type in your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll raise these at the end of this presentation on your behalf. And please use the chat button for your comments and the Q&A button for your questions. So it's over to you, Sam, please.
Thanks very much, Sharon, for the kind introduction. And look, may I say thank you to AIOH for the opportunity to speak. I think it's fundamentally important for Safe Work Australia to have a good working relationship with AIOH. And I'm really pleased to be speaking with you today about our Occupational Lung Diseases Work Plan and hot off the press, the Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement for managing the risks of RCS at work. So while I introduce myself, I might also share my screen. I'm not so good at multitasking, everybody, so please bear with me. Okay, I hope you can see that. Otherwise, could someone give me a thumbs up if you can see that, please? Hopefully that's working. I hope the hand up is a thumbs up, Sharon. All good. So look, just by way of background, in a past life I was a veterinarian and decided to jump ship from private practice and become an epidemiologist. I've worked for many years in the biosecurity space and emergency preparedness, and also in public health and One Health. And I came to Safe Work Australia in February 2021, principally to work on our COVID guidance. Which I'm sure you will have seen. That's not the topic for today, but I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have on where that's at and also where that might go. So today, as I said, we're talking about our Occupational Lung Diseases Work Plan and also the Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement. I should say at the start, I'm really happy if you want to put the questions in the chat as we go, and I'll try and address them as we go. But otherwise, if there's some I've missed, we'll hold them over to the end. Okay, here we go. So if, like me, it's a bit of a grey day where you are and it's pretty cold, I thought I'd give you the key messages to start off with, just to reinforce those really. I'll talk a little bit about Safe Work Australia, although I'm sure most, if not all of the audience, have a pretty good understanding of who we are and what we do. I'll go over our Occupational Lung Diseases Work Plan. I'll talk about the national policy context in which we work, particularly how our Occupational Lung Diseases Work Plan intersects or overlaps as a bit of a Venn diagram with some of the work following the National Dust Diseases Task Force work that's being led by the Commonwealth Department of Health. One thing I'd really like to do is encourage a submission from AIOH about this CRIS that I'll talk about. It's not going to be a reading from the CRIS. I'll just give you the high level points. And I'd also like to raise awareness of a couple of other reports that SWAR has just published that will be of interest, really relating to the measurement of respirable crystalline silica. So just briefly about Safe Work Australia, we're a tripartite body, and that was one of the real reasons why I was interested in coming to work here, to see how the interaction between governments, employer groups and the unions operate to harmonise the work health and safety laws. As I'm sure you all know, we've overseen a large degree of harmonisation of the model work health and safety laws, which are enacted in all jurisdictions with the exception of Victoria. And our mission is to promote continuous improvements in safety outcomes while ensuring that they're practicable for small business and workers. And we're a key source of high quality, nationally significant data and research to try and inform the development of new work health and safety and workers' compensation policy. So over to the Occupational Lung Diseases Work Plan. There's a link down the bottom there, and I'm really happy to share a PDF of this presentation just so you don't have to write it down. So really the overarching goal of the Occupational Lung Diseases Work Plan was to set out what, for our members and for our stakeholders, what we're going to do this calendar year. Safe Work Australia has maintained a work plan since 2018, but we saw the need to refresh that given a lot of the work had already been completed. It has 4 broad objectives. One's to ensure that the model work health and safety laws support minimising exposure to occupational lung disease hazards. The second is to ensure that PCBUs, so persons conducting business or undertaking, workers and other duty holders are aware of the risks of hazardous airborne contaminants. The third is to support research on, particularly on methods to detect hazardous airborne contaminants and also the effectiveness of workplace controls. And the last one, which I think is critically important, is to evaluate the effectiveness of these initiatives as well. So, as I mentioned, the first objective is around ensuring the model work health and safety laws are fit for purpose. And the principal work in the section next to ours is undertaking the review of the workplace exposure standards, which I know has been a key focus for AIOH. As I'm sure you well understand, it's a substantial project looking at exposure standards for over 700 chemicals and chemical groups. And it's really quite close to making recommendations for work health and safety ministers. There's also another piece of work. There'll be some additional chemicals to look into to see whether a a WES is appropriate, and so there'll be some work on diesel engine emissions and diesel fuel in particular. We'd like also to complete this regulatory impact analysis to minimise exposures to respirable crystalline silica and take the results of this consultation to work health and safety ministers this year. Of course, it'll take some time to progress any amendments that ministers would agree to, but that's certainly on the radar as well. And also we're progressing some amendments to the model work health and safety regulations as a bit of an avoidance of doubt regulation, really, to prohibit the uncontrolled processing of engineered stones. So our legal team are quite well advanced working with the drafters on that regulatory change. So the second objective was around awareness. So there's a couple of recommendations here related to our asbestos work that were mentioned in the Boland review of the model work health and safety laws. The first is to consult on and develop guidance on the definition. Oh, sorry, I just saw Karen's. Any chance I can hide the little screen? I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the little screen is, but I'll keep on going. So we're looking at what the definitive competent person should be for asbestos-related tasks under the model WHS laws, and we'll release a consultation paper in the coming months on that one for public comment. We're developing some information sheets to improve the quality of asbestos registers, and that'll be released shortly. We're publishing a revised national guide on working with silica and silica-containing products, so that was revised and published this January. And now we're working on the translations into 6 other languages for people with a non-English speaking background. And we're also planning to develop and promote some materials around the model code of practice on engineered stone, which was published in the second half of last year. In terms of supporting research, one of the things our members were very keen when they could for us to do when they considered reducing the workplace exposure standard for respirable crystalline silica and late last year was to review air monitoring technologies to inform any future changes to the time-weighted average, and also look into the possible development of a STEL for respirable crystalline silica. And the reports that I'll mention at the end cover that, which will be of interest to the audience, I'm sure. And we're also very interested in commissioning some more research into the effectiveness of engineering controls, particularly to minimise exposure to respirable crystalline silica for people processing engineered stone. And we're looking, we're very interested in the results of the iCare funded research from the University of Adelaide to inform that work. In terms of evaluation, we're also planning to develop a national work health and safety evaluation framework to measure the impacts of these measures, and want to have that framework agreed by our members by the end of this year. I hope that's not too ambitious. So some stakeholders, and I think AIOH has been one of them, have felt a little bit confused about all of this national policy work and where it fits in. There's a lot of work, as I mentioned, being led by the Commonwealth Department of Health and also the then Attorney General's Department in the response to the National Dust Disease Task Force final report. I hope you will have seen the All of Government's response to that report, where all of the recommendations are either noted or supported. And there's quite a number of initiatives the Department of Health and also the Department of Education, Skills and Employment are progressing in this space too. I'll just mention those. The first is the development of a national silicosis prevention strategy, and underneath that a national action plan, which AIOH has been involved in developing. The next is development of a monitoring evaluation framework for the National Dust Disease Task Force report, which is also another piece of work that's underway at the moment. One of the things I'm particularly excited about is the development of a national occupational respiratory disease registry, which will have mandatory reporting of all silicosis cases. So we'll have a much better handle on the incidence of silicosis in Australia, which has been one of the major challenges for the CRIS, as I'll talk about in a moment. And I understand skills ministers are considering some nationally recognised training packages on silica safety awareness. And so we're expecting to hear shortly, hopefully, some good news about the approval of those. So next, I'll give you the brief overview of the consultation RIS. I certainly don't want to steal its thunder. It's 83 pages worth of quite detailed analysis, and it's taken a lot of effort from us and also Ernst & Young, our consultants, to produce it. So I hope AIOH feels that it's meeting the mark. So I thought I might just take a step back and talk about what regulatory impact analysis is. So it's a structured process to consider the impact of any proposed regulatory change. And it consists of a series of 7 questions, going from what the policy problem is, talking about the justification for government action, describing the policy options, looking at the economic impact of each option, talk about the consultation process, then considering the best option, and talking about how that option would be implemented and then evaluated as well. So of course, a consultation RIS is only part of that step. It's getting to our consultation RIS talks about the impacts of each option and tries to weigh up each one, but certainly doesn't come to a preferred option. But if you're very interested in this process, it's a useful process in my opinion. There's a link here for the guide that the ministers' meetings like Safe Work Australia and Work Health and Safety Ministers must follow. So this is just a bit of a plug, really, this slide. This is a screen grabber of our Engage page, and I'd encourage you all to go after this talk and download the CRIS and have a look at it in your own time. Our consultation will close on the 15th of August, so there's about 6 weeks, just over 6 weeks of time to have a look at it. And yeah, again, just really would encourage for a response from AIOH and also from any individuals who are interested in responding as well. So the scope of this quiz considers all workplaces where workers may be exposed to hazardous levels of respirable crystalline silica, but only those that are subject to the model work health and safety laws. So that means all jurisdictions in Australia, including the Commonwealth, with the exception of Victoria, and that quarrying and mining in New South Wales, Queensland, Tasmania, and Western Australia are out of scope for the study. Just giving you a walkthrough of the work that's been done in the report. There's quite a substantial analysis on what the policy problem is. I think it's undoubtable that there's been an increase in incidence of silicosis and also silica-related diseases in Australia. And it's particularly unfortunate because these diseases are irreversible, in many cases debilitating, and are largely caused by workplace exposures. Even more unfortunate, I suppose, is, as you very well know, these diseases are entirely preventable through appropriate controls. And some of the issues that we've identified, both through our analysis and also the preliminary consultation that we did, was that some of the underlying issues are around a lack of awareness of the risks, a lack of clarity in the model health and safety laws, and also in some cases, a lack of compliance. So these data on the right-hand side represent accepted workers' compensation claims for silicosis over 10 years, from 2010-11 to 2019-20. And there are 412 claims accepted, and a substantial increase in 2018-19, as you can see on the slide. I believe that's largely because of the results of health screening programs that have occurred in many jurisdictions in Australia, but unfortunately we can't, those data aren't matched, so we can't determine who was identified through health screening and who's been identified through other means. Another important point to raise is that about 3/4 of these accepted claims were in the manufacturing, mining and construction sectors. So they're not only in the engineered stone sector, despite the recent focus in that cohort of people. So just moving on to quickly talk about the options that we've considered. All regulatory backed statements need to consider the base case, just as a comparison. And in this case, that base case considers things like the enactment of the Model Code of Practice for Engineered Stone that I mentioned, the soon to be implemented changes to the Model WHS regulations around uncontrolled processing of engineered stone as well, and also recent awareness campaigns. The second option that we put forward was around awareness and behaviour change initiatives, and really moving beyond awareness as, I guess, an information deficit problem, and looking at how can we actually change the behaviours of people, and not only workers and PCBUs, but this would also look at the behaviours of other duty holders, so officers, designers, and commissioners of plant, suppliers and manufacturers, and so forth. The third option, which was based on the recent changes to the Victorian Occupational, I'm going with the fourth option. The third option was around clarifying the existing requirements in the Model Work Health and Safety regulations for a list of defined high-risk silica processes. And those were based on the Victorian Occupational Health and Safety regulations. So those processes would be the use of power tools and machinery that generates silica dust, the use of road headers, focusing on tunnelling, quarrying involving material that is a crystalline silica substance, mechanical screening involving material that is a crystalline silica substance, tunnelling, and any other process that might expose or reasonably be likely to expose someone to respirable crystalline silica. So it's designed to be quite broad, but also specifically name particular processes to clarify the existing requirements of Model Work Health and Safety regulations. Our fourth option, again, based on the Occupational Health and Safety amendments in Victoria that happened recently, was a national licensing framework for persons conducting a business or undertaking who are working with engineered stone. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And our fifth option was around additional regulation for those defined high-risk crystalline silica processes, looking at things like mandatory reporting of air monitoring and health monitoring data, mandatory risk assessments, and mandatory implementation of silica risk control plans. So just quickly to further illustrate these options, option 1 has no additional regulatory impact. Option 2 is a purely national awareness and behaviour change initiative, which of course could be paired with any of the other preferred options if that was preferred. Option 3 is really an avoidance of doubt change to clarify the existing regulations and the model laws. Option 4, the licensing for engineered stone, would implement a national licensing framework, would have mandatory air and health monitoring reporting to work health and safety regulators. There'd be a mandatory requirement for risk assessments and also a mandatory requirement to implement an engineered stone control plan. What's unfortunately just been cut off from this slide was that there would also be increased regulator activity as well under this option. I'll just quickly mention option 5. I think I covered it pretty well just before, but it would also clarify the existing requirements in the model WHS laws, but would require mandatory reporting of air and health monitoring data, risk assessments, and also control plans. There are a few options that we considered but were deemed infeasible in the words of RISs. The first was a ban on the importation or use of engineered stone, and there were 2 reasons for that. The first is that Australian governments agreed that this should be considered in July 2024 or later in the response to the National Dust Disease Task Force report. And also this is not only a problem for the model work health and safety laws, there would certainly be work at the customs level as well to implement that, just like the ban on asbestos. We also considered the possibility of replacing chest X-ray with low-dose HRCT as a requirement for health monitoring. But the reasons why that wasn't considered, at least in this consultation RIS, it may be considered in the decision RIS, were because there are already provisions for medical practitioners to choose to prescribe HRCT because it's an equal or better method of health monitoring. But also we heard, particularly from people in regional Australia, that were concerns about workers' access to low-dose HRCT. And there were worries that if the bar was raised, then that might be another barrier to people actually accessing health monitoring. The last thing that we couldn't consider, unfortunately, was the cost recovery of licensing fees so that that revenue could be used to regulate the engineered stone sector. And that's because it's technically, well, legally infeasible for us to do under the work health and safety laws. It'd have to be done at the jurisdictional level to set the appropriate fees and charges. So I'll just give a brief overview of the likely costs, but first, what's not on the slide was an assessment that EY did for us around the cost per case of silicosis. Now, that was about $4.07 million. And that's based on the value, the so-called value of the statistical life year, which I think is a bit of an uncomfortable concept for me. I've only just come across it because of this project. But it's essentially, in economic terms, it's what society would pay not to have a case of silicosis. I have some difficulties with that explanation. I think we all have non-economic values as well in terms of our lives and livelihoods. So in terms of the net present costs of these options, the option 2 and 3 were of course the cheapest because they'd have no regulatory burden. Option 4 was moderately expensive over 10 years. It had cost about $24 million to implement. But option 5, which is a little bit of a surprise to me, was quite expensive, an order of magnitude more expensive. And that's because of the sheer number of businesses we're talking about where people where these regulatory changes would be enacted. There were about 22,000 businesses of all sizes in our estimates for the economic analysis. On the right-hand side, I'll just give you a quick explanation of what this break-even analysis means, but when you read the RIS, you'll be able to go into any more depth. This is simply the net present cost of each option divided by the cost per case of silica. So the benefits of avoiding each case of silicosis, excuse me. And so, for example, for the licensing scheme, you'd need to avoid about 6 cases of silicosis over 10 years for that to pay off in economic terms. We also found it quite difficult to assess the possible effectiveness of each option quantitatively in an economic analysis, and did so in a more of a qualitative way. But I'll just go over some of the key highlights for me. So the National Awareness and Behaviour Change initiative would provide much more industry-specific information to workers and PCBUs and other duty holders, and really target behaviour change and improving compliance. And it also aimed to reach a broad audience across a wider range of industries, so not just the engineered stone sector that's been concentrated on often in the past. Under option 3, the clarification of the model work health and safety laws. Of course, this would clarify what high-risk silica work is and what PCBUs would need to do to meet those requirements. It also addressed some concerns, particularly amongst that were reported in the National Dust Disease Task Force report, around some of the subjective thresholds in the model work health and safety laws. And one of those is around, well, of course, workers exposed to crystalline silica are required to, must be provided health monitoring if there's a significant risk to their health and safety. And I think the term significant risk is open to interpretation. Okay, so in terms of option 4, the licensing framework, of course, it would provide an incentive for people working with engineered stone to become licensed, and might also, for people who decide not to become licensed, promote using alternative products. It would ensure licensees assess the risks. It would increase the likelihood of adoption of appropriate control measures and air monitoring and health monitoring. It would result in greater compliance and enforcement through scheduled and unscheduled compliance visits. It would provide regulators with better information about the number and location of workplaces, and also would allow regulators to have access to air monitoring and health monitoring data so they could better understand the risks. But of course, one thing this option, it's almost stating bleeding obvious really, one thing this option doesn't do is it doesn't include any further regulation in any other sector. So it's only focusing on about 1,000 PCBUs rather than the 22,000 businesses I mentioned before. In terms of option 5, we would see that it would increase the likelihood of PCBUs being aware of the risks and knowing about the need to implement controls. It requires risk assessments and silica risk control plans, and it will allow regulators again to access air monitoring and health monitoring data. That's a bit of a potted summary of the RIS in itself, but the main purpose of the consultation RIS is, of course, consultation, and we've got a number of questions in there that we're seeking specific feedback on. Of course, we'd welcome any and all feedback and not just on these questions. But we're particularly interested in comments around our chapter on the problem statement, whether the options are fit for purpose, whether the methods are appropriate and the parameter estimates are sound, whether we've nailed, well, whether we've considered in full and fully the effectiveness of each option. We're also interested in what individuals and groups think about the options and what the preferred option or options might be in their opinion. And also in particular, if there are any significant barriers to the implementation of the options as well. Lastly, I promised just to mention those reports, and I really wanted to thank Laurie Glossop and Chris White for their work on the report on the left, the Measuring Respirable Crystalline Silica report, which is being used and is particularly useful for the work I mentioned around lowering the workplace exposure standard potentially. There's also a report that we published recently on the possibility of a short-term exposure limit for RCS as well. So I've got those links in my presentation and you can access those in your own time. So look, that's all from me. Over to you. Do you have any questions for me?
Okay, now I'm not seeing any questions there, Sam, but you've given me a lot of, since no one's asking anything and I can't see anything in the chat, I'm going to take the opportunity because I have loads of things on my mind. And I really would welcome, we've got half an hour here. So members, if you've got any questions, it is a great opportunity to speak to Sam. He's given us a fabulous presentation, a lot of information actually. And I think you've really got some challenges there, Sam. So some of the things on my mind, and I'm putting my occupational hygienist hat on, there is a lot of data out there I know on engineered stone, because in the last couple of years, the regulators have been out there monitoring. I live in Victoria and I know the inspectors are asking the fabricators to get their baseline data. So there is a lot of data available on that industry. And I suspect, I mean, you've ring fence quarrying and mining. So I'm going to look at construction industry. And again, I think there'd be a lot of industry information there. Does Safe Work Australia get access to this information? Because it seems like part of the missing links in being able to develop your plan.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And to some extent, yes, but in many cases, no. And I think you're quite right. There's a wealth of data and information out there, not only quantitative data and around air monitoring and health monitoring, but also qualitative data about people's professional experiences. Which adds to the richness of the picture. I hope that didn't sound too trite. And I think, you know, as a whole sector, we can have better access to data and make more from it. I'm not sure how aware your membership is of some of the work in British Columbia, where the construction industry has collated data on air monitoring for people undertaking particular processes. And I think there's tremendous benefit in that. The way it's presented, though, you don't really get a full understanding of the situation that someone's been doing the air monitoring in. Yeah. And there can be only a few data points, but I think it's a great benefit in sharing those data. Yeah. Just to add to that, though, one of the things in my experience across all the sectors I've worked in is trust is the key thing that holds sharing data back. Yeah. And I'm really hoping that at least that evaluation framework will build that trust.
Look, and actually that was my second point. I mean, I worked in industry for many years, and I wondered whether there was an opportunity for the industry groups to try and collate the data that's been collected by their hygienists or their contractors in that industry and take out, you know, the identification and things like that. But because primarily you're interested in what are the tasks and what are the potential exposures, and therefore start to build a database to be able to profile the high risk areas, rather than, it must be very difficult on your side of the fence where you hear a lot of stories and a lot of information, but you actually don't see the tasks and you don't see the data for the task. Maybe that's the privilege I have as a hygienist. When someone talks about a task, I've been there, I see what those numbers mean in real terms about an exposure, not just numbers on a piece of paper. So
look, I think those sorts of field experiences are really important, Sharon.
The other one, okay, so I've got a statement here that Queensland regulators have also been gathering baseline data for all the benchtop fabricators here. So again, that comes back to you. It sounds like you don't get access to the regulators' data. They don't take away identification. That Safe Work Australia, I know, is in a totally different part of the organisation system, and they work with the regulators, but you can't seem to get the regulators to share some of that data. I don't want to go into the politics of this, but is that a difficult area to go into?
Yeah, look, I think it can be. I think in general, data sharing across all of work health and safety nationally is a bit of a challenge, and I'm mindful of some of the discussions around the new national strategy as well, around targets and indicators and things like that. So, look, again, I'd be hopeful that by building that trust, we can share data a bit better. I'm seeing a couple of questions pop up in the chat.
Yes, I've got some questions here. So for one of the questions for Shelley, so what happens where mining is covered in WHS regs? Because I noticed you ring fence those in one of your slides.
Yeah, I might not have been super clear, I'm afraid. So the scope was where mining is not included in a chapter in the model work health and safety regulations in a particular state, it's ring fenced. It's not, and quarrying as well. But where it is included in a chapter in the model regs, it was included in the RIS itself. So where Shelley, in particular, I'm particularly interested to hear from you about what you think about that. And yeah, really happy to have that conversation. Because from an economic perspective, in terms of the analysis, it's easy now for us to include or exclude particular factors.
Okay, another question here from Cameron Hunter. Hi, Sam. Did you mention that there is research into new technologies for RCS monitoring? Yeah,
so look, that's something that we're really just starting to research. I'll might hand over to Lee Threadgold, who's just started with us, who's leading that project, to see if Lee would like to add any further comment.
Lee can...
I can see Lee online, that's good.
Okay, so can Lee unmute herself, Michelle, please? Well, that's not possible because I think Michelle has muted everyone. Except
that's
us.
A shame. I tried to unmute Lee, but I'm not allowed to. So look, yeah, look, I'll give a potted summary, and Lee can tell me where I've got it wrong.
Lee should be able to unmute. Lee should be able to unmute himself because he's a panelist.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect.
Sorry, I had to join by my phone because I couldn't get the webinar to load on my computer. So sorry, I missed what you referred to me for, Sam.
Oh, Lee, I'll just read the question out. So it was from Cameron Hunter. Did I mention that there is research into new technologies for respirable crystalline silica monitoring? I just thought you could give a quick overview of the work that you're starting.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. We are, of course, aware of the new portable RCS monitor that's coming onto the market from New South Wales, but we're also interested in supporting future work looking at lowering detection limits for RCS that may facilitate future reductions in the WES. So that's a project that is looking to kick off in this new year. So I'm not sure how much detail you want.
Very good. There's a few other questions in the chat. Sharon, do you want me to read them out? Is that okay?
That is fine. Yep.
Okay, so from David, is there any reason why the model work health and safety laws do not cover some states? And is there any plan to bring all states into the fold? Oh, gee, that's a big question, and I'm not sure, not sure how much time we've got to go into it. But yeah, look, there was when the model laws were established, there was always that intention that all jurisdictions would sign up. But as I mentioned, Victoria's the last jurisdiction not to. I'm not sure whether I can fully answer why, but certainly, yeah, I mean, one of the missions of Safe Work Australia is national harmonisation.
Oh. Okay, the next one from Dusty.
So I mentioned BC. How is Safe Work Australia working with other international groups, since this is not an issue unique to Australia? Look, that's a fair point, and I think, I guess COVID has affected all of our ability to travel and network and meet new people. Certainly during this CRIS, we've been looking quite intently at what other jurisdictions are doing internationally. I'm not aware of any other jurisdictions who are, for example, considering a licensing scheme for engineered stone. That said, though, particularly on the workplace exposure standards side, there's some very, very strong collaborations between Australia, and our delegate for the GHS is within Safe Work Australia, New Zealand, the US and Canada. There's also, I believe, some discussions with the UK and European community as well. So yes, certainly if there's any initiatives that you're aware, Dusty, that would be relevant for this consultation RIS, please let me know. I'd be very keen to hear from you.
Okay. There's a comment here in the chat line from Antoine saying, we've been using has dust 7204 pumps here, which allowed to take gravimetric filter samples as well as take real-time data that can be plotted on a graph. Very useful to isolate tasks and see spikes in total dusts.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think actually that's an interesting one where people are going with direct reading instruments and videotaping, which is really very much focused on identifying those short tasks where are giving the spikes, or they could be longer, but it's much more task-based. And to me, it's got a process safety view about it as opposed to monitoring against an exposure standard. It's really got a different emphasis to that, which I think is really a healthier way to go, because just monitoring based on, on a time-weighted average doesn't mean you're going to see some of the dusty short-term tasks. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this, I guess, shakes out in view of long-term health effects of silica and the role of short-term exposures.
And I think Lee puts it really well. Breathing any dust is potentially hazardous. So why would you, So I think a real-time measurement or near real-time measurement is going to be very useful. It's a bit of a shame we can't have a bit of a plenary discussion, because I would be very interested to hear about how those sorts of more rapid technologies might work in changing people's behaviour.
Oh, yeah.
So they can see an answer quite quickly. This was what I did, and this is what the effects of that was.
Oh, yeah. Actually, Sam, I think that's very powerful when people see things, and particularly when you're talking about respirable dust, where you may not see it in the air, and but you're doing measurements. It's coming up with numbers. It's much more powerful. Just people seeing numbers, but then there's some issues about how you manage the interpretation. But I think when I'm speaking personally, I see technologies allowing us to do different things today compared to where we were, say, maybe 10, 20 years ago, and particularly much more emphasis on controls rather than taking samples, which are where I think it should be going. And again, I just say that as a person, as a hygienist who grew up with process safety, which is being, at the end of the day, it's controlling the exposures as opposed to complying with standards, so to speak. Yeah. Okay. Right. Now, can I just share a comment about engineered stone? And I'll be interested in your comments. And I guess I know there's a lot of regulators on the line. I've actually done a lot of work with fabricators and engineered stone. And what surprises me is that they all use virtually the same techniques. Sam, I'm not sure if you've been to a fabricator's place, but it's the same techniques to cut slabs of engineered stone. I have heard recently that the engineered stone suppliers are moving to a lower content of quartz in their material, and I think the pressure would be on to come up with a new product. But it seemed to me for an activity that's quite simple as a task base, why we are doing so much as opposed to saying this is the controls you need to put in place. We have those codes. At the end of the day, it needs an inspector and someone to go out there and just verify it with some figures. It seems to me something that can come back under control quite well in view of the amount of attention that is received in the last 2 years by the inspectors. I know when talking to inspectors in other states, they've gone out, but it's still the same tasks that people are doing. It strikes me that we should be able to just bring those exposures right down below the 0.05 level.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really hopeful comment, Sharon. Look, I heard a couple of other hopeful things in the last few weeks. One was, and it's not so great for our economy that labour costs are increasing, but I've heard of some fabricators moving to CNC machines just because they can't get the staff and doing only a little bit of hand finishing at the end. So to me, it seems that it may be cost effective to automate and isolate those risks from people. Another really hopeful thing, my wife's an interior designer and used to commission a lot of engineered stone, particularly in office buildings, and particularly for the Commonwealth, actually, which is a bit of a shame for me. But her whole business has decided not to commission engineered stone anymore on the basis of the model code.
Yeah.
it's their duty as architects and interior designers to be looking at the product life cycle. So there is change, you know, and, you know, I mean, it's 2022. People shouldn't be getting diseases of antiquity, in my opinion.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you say that, because I think the marketplace often dictates a lot of these issues. And I'm really pleased to hear that people are responding to that. I know some people will go back to buying Laminex or one of those treatments as opposed to going to engineered stone for the same reason you're talking about. So yeah, you're right. The behaviours are changing there. Right. Can I see any more questions here? Okay.
Where are we up to?
Someone's saying
comments.
Yeah.
I did see one from Antoine that I can deal with quite quickly. So are we in discussions with different states in regards to upcoming state legislation and codes of practice? Yeah, look, we are to some extent. So the model code of practice has been implemented in New South Wales and Tasmania so far. Some states have indicated that they're going to go with their own bespoke versions. But look, over time, hopefully many, or if not all adopt it. Shelley mentioned installation remaining an issue with on-tool options. Yeah, that's a fair point, of course.
I see Sharon Gaskin saying installation will remain an issue for engineered stone, so some on-tool options are needed. But again, that is just an engineering option and making, and in a space that doesn't make it excessively expensive to, you know, you can screw the marketplace depending on how you charge things. So small operators are forced out of it. You know, again, some people have got more money to buy the better equipment, so to speak. I mean, I think, you know, you talked about the computer operated systems now for cutting. I think, again, you probably find that some of those small operators that were there 2 and 3 years ago when the dry cutting and bad work practices were happening, I suspect some of those people are being forced out of the industry because they can't keep up with some of the technology changes. And I saw someone here. Has any research been done on the binders used in benchtop industry? My occupational hygienist gut tells me that there are binders accelerant to silica-based diseases, which is why we're seeing the spike in that industry rather than quarrying, for example. Any comments you've got there, Sam, from your experiences?
Look, I'm not aware of any particular research, and others might want to correct me if they're aware of some, but certainly it's a question that comes up quite a bit. The other things in engineered stone and how hazardous they might be as well. Resins, I think that some, you know, the aluminium in some cases with the shiny surfaces, for example, you know, shiny flecks. And Sharon's answered the question. University of Adelaide doing some work. Thank you very much, Sharon. Very much appreciate that.
Yeah, there's some good work going on there. Question I have for you, another one that's on my mind. The focus has been on engineered stone in the last 2 or 3 years. With all the focus on silica, have there been other industries, small, the medium-sized operators, that's come to light where silica could be a potential issue as a manufactured material, putting aside the construction industry type activities, but in manufacturing, have you seen anything else starting to emerge that perhaps needs greater scrutiny and risk assessments?
Oh, gee, I mean, we talked about those high-risk silica processes before, but there's ubiquitous, as everyone knows, so many people are exposed to silica at work. I'm sure you're very well aware of nearly 600,000 people exposed to RCS in varying degrees as an estimate in 2011. There's an estimate in the RIS just looking at the number of industries that might have silica exposures. That I think that covers about 1.4 million workers. So there's so many possibilities. I mean, yeah. I'm sure, Sharon, you're well aware of the very sad workers' compensation case recently of an art teacher working with ceramics in Victoria. So yeah, I'm not aware of any, aside from construction, any other small businesses, but gee, I wouldn't be surprised if there's something I don't know about.
Yeah. Yeah, well, hopefully, I thought as a hygienist, we can help identify some of those areas long before you start finding a fibrosis or a silicosis of the lungs. I think it's great that the registry is being set up, and we need that. But for some ways, it's a bit after the event, rather than where being a hygienist, we really want to protect workers' health long before it gets to that stage. So, okay, so if there's no more questions, look, I might draw this to a close and say thank you, Sam, for being so open and really with the information and the discussion we've had today. I'm so excited about what the work that Safe Work Australia is doing on Silica, and hope that I'd love to see the Institute can work with you. I'm sure we're with people, with our great president, with Kate as our leader, who knows so much about silica and the construction industry. And we have some fantastic, again, hygienists in the mining sector. You know, we've really got the people who know a lot about the silica exposures that are out there. Love to work with you and continue to help build a better workplace for workers and protect them against silica. So thank you so much for giving up your time today.
Oh, and thanks kindly for the opportunity and the introduction. Much appreciated. See you later, everyone.
Okay, bye now.